Christianity did not begin as a single locked room with one voice speaking from the center. It began as a storm of memory, hope, fear, letters, visions, communities, and arguments about what salvation truly meant. The ancient secret was not simply that some teachings were buried. It was that before the walls of doctrine hardened, many believers were still asking what kind of freedom the soul had received. This archive does not open to sensationalize a faith or to dismantle what millions have held sacred across 2,000 years. It opens because there is a wound beneath the doctrine, a wound that spiritual traditions rarely acknowledge, which is the wound of early uncertainty. Before any creed was finalized, before any council declared what was true and what was forbidden, there were voices, communities, and texts that asked different questions, reached different conclusions, and prayed in ways that would later be called dangerous. This video is the story of that wound and what it still holds. The pain is not unique to Christianity. Every great spiritual tradition carries the memory of its own buried voices. But something specific happened in the first 3 centuries after the life of Jesus of Nazareth, something that shaped not only a religion, but the entire spiritual imagination of the Western world. Understanding that moment does not require cynicism. It requires only the willingness to sit quietly with a more complicated and more beautiful history than we were often given. So we open the archive. We step past the familiar image of early Christianity as a single unified faith, waiting patiently for Rome to recognize it. We step instead into a world of scattered letters carried across desert roads, of small communities meeting in hidden rooms, of arguments conducted in Greek and Aramaic and Coptic about the nature of God, the meaning of the resurrection, and the question of what the soul was meant to become. This is not the Christianity of councils and cathedrals. This is something older, stranger, and far more alive with spiritual hunger. The world into which the earliest Christian communities were born was not a world waiting peacefully for a new religion. It was a world saturated with competing gods, collapsing certainties, and imperial pressure that crushed whatever could not be organized into obedience. The Roman Empire was not merely a political structure, it was a theological claim. The emperor was divine. The gods of Rome demanded loyalty. To profess devotion to a crucified Jewish teacher, to call him Lord in a world where only Caesar held that title, was already an act of radical spiritual defiance. Persecution was not abstract for these early communities. It arrived at the door literally in the form of soldiers, informants, and legal proceedings. Believers were asked to burn incense to Roman gods or face consequences that ranged from social exile to execution. Under this pressure, a community does not have the luxury of endless internal debate. It begins to feel, with increasing urgency, the need for unity, for clarity, for a single answer to the question of who they were and what they believed. Theology born under persecution is theology written with one eye on the door. And yet the memory of Jesus himself was not yet settled into any single authorized account. The letters of Paul had circulated for decades before any gospel was written in its final form. Communities in Alexandria read different texts than communities in Antioch. A believer in Carthage might have encountered teachings about the inner nature of Christ that a believer in Rome would barely recognize. The age needed a teaching that could hold frightened people together And what it found was also what it lost: the permission for the soul to remain genuinely free in its own searching. Strip away the doctrinal arguments, the imperial politics, the councils and the canons, and what remains beneath all of it is simply human hunger. People who had heard something, who had been touched by something they could not name, who had gathered in the dark and broken bread together and felt for a moment that the distance between themselves and the sacred was not as vast as they had feared. This hunger was not theological in any academic sense. It was intimate, urgent, and personal. It was the hunger of people who had known death and loneliness and the failure of every ordinary promise, and who needed something that went all the way down. What made the earliest Christian communities so magnetic was precisely this sense of immediate contact with the divine. The Spirit, as it was described in the earliest texts, did not flow only through official channels. It moved where it would. It rested on those who were poor, despised, and forgotten. It spoke through women and slaves and foreign wanderers. It made the invisible visible and the far off near. For the human soul hungry enough to believe this, no institutional framework could fully contain the experience. And that tension between the hunger for direct encounter and the structure needed to protect a growing community is the hidden fault line running through all of early Christian history. The story we often receive about early Christianity is one of gradual, painful, but essentially linear progress toward a unified faith. Persecution gave way to tolerance. Tolerance gave way to recognition. And the church eventually stood whole and triumphant against the shadows of the ancient world. This is not a false story, but it is an incomplete one. What it tends to omit is the extraordinary variety of voices, texts, and spiritual visions that were present from the very beginning, and that did not simply disappear when councils made their decisions. They were buried, sometimes literally, in desert sands, in sealed jars beneath monastery floors, in the footnotes of hostile theological arguments written by those who had won. The crack in the official story does not begin with the discovery of ancient manuscripts in the modern era, though those discoveries deepened it dramatically. It begins in the early texts themselves, where even the surviving canon contains traces of arguments that were never fully resolved. Paul and James disagree about faith and works in ways that later traditions struggled to harmonize. The Gospels present portraits of Jesus that are not always easy to reconcile. The book of Revelation speaks in symbols so dense and strange that they have supported wildly different interpretations across every century. The unity of early Christianity, when examined closely, reveals itself to be not a starting point, but a destination, and one that required enormous effort, real exclusion, and genuine loss to reach. In 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif, not far from the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. What he uncovered was not immediately understood for what it was. The large clay jar he broke open contained 13 leather-bound codices, papyrus texts written in the Coptic language, texts that had been sealed and buried, likely in the late 4th century, possibly by monks who feared what the hardening orthodoxy of their age would do to them. What those texts contained would slowly, over the following decades, reshape the way scholars and seekers understood the origins of the Christian tradition. The Nag Hammadi Library, as it came to be known, contained more than 50 texts. Some were philosophical treatises rooted in a tradition now called Gnosticism, a word derived from the Greek gnosis, meaning knowledge, specifically the kind of knowledge that is not merely information, but direct inner experience of the divine. Others were Gospels, including the Gospel of Thomas, which presents Jesus not as a sacrificial Savior in the classical theological sense, but as a revealer of hidden wisdom, someone who points seekers toward the living light already present within them. The texts were not the invention of rebels or madmen. They were the spiritual archives of communities that had understood their faith in a particular way, a way that the councils of a later century would refuse to recognize. What emerges from these buried codices is not a single alternative Christianity, but a constellation of early spiritual visions, each distinct, each alive with its own imagery and inner logic. Some speak of the divine not as a distant king, but as a living silence within the soul. Some describe creation not as an act of benevolent omnipotence, but as the result of a rupture in the divine order, a wound in the fabric of being that the soul must trace back to its source. Some suggest that the resurrection was not only an event in a tomb outside Jerusalem, but an experience that could be entered even now, in this life, through awakening, through the recognition of what the soul already carried inside it. These were not casual revisions of the tradition. They were, for those who held them, the living heart of the teaching. The first real revelation is this: what we now call Christianity was, for at least its first 2 centuries, something far more diverse, far more contested, and far more spiritually alive with unresolved questions than the institutional portrait suggests. Scholars of early Christian history have spent decades documenting this diversity, and though their debates are complex, a central fact emerges with remarkable consistency. The believers of the 1st and 2nd centuries were not reading from a single agreed-upon text. They were not organized under a single authority. They were not unified around a single interpretation of what Jesus had meant, what salvation required, or what the soul was ultimately made of. In communities across Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and North Africa, different teachers offered different maps of the inner world. Some emphasized the absolute transcendence of God, a divine reality so far beyond the material world that only a special kind of inner vision could approach it. Some taught that the material world itself was not simply fallen, but was the product of a lesser power, a divine accident rather than a perfect creation, and that the soul's purpose was to remember its origin in a light above even the God described in the scriptures of Israel. These were not fringe ideas whispered by isolated, eccentric thinkers. They were the living theology of real communities, communities that prayed, that fasted, that cared for the sick, that buried their dead, and that understood themselves as followers of a truth that their own tradition had always carried. Spiritual diversity is not, in itself, dangerous to a movement in its early stages. In fact, it can be a sign of genuine vitality, of a teaching so rich that it generates multiple forms of engagement and interpretation. What changes the situation entirely is the moment when a movement becomes an institution, when survival, power, and social coherence begin to demand not variety, but uniformity. This is the moment when diversity stops being a sign of life and begins to be perceived as a threat. And this is the moment that arrived for early Christianity with particular force in the 3rd and 4th centuries, as the tradition moved from the margins of the Roman Empire toward its center. What made the diversity of early Christian thought specifically threatening to the emerging institutional church was not simply its existence, but its implications. If different communities could hold genuinely different beliefs about the nature of God, the meaning of Christ, the structure of salvation, and the authority of the soul, then no single hierarchy could claim to speak for all of them. If the divine spark was truly available to every seeker through direct inner experience, then bishops, creeds, and councils were not the only gate through which the sacred could be accessed. This was not merely a theological problem, it was a political one, a structural one, and for those who felt the weight of keeping a fragile movement alive under imperial pressure, an existential one. The great councils of the early church, Nicaea in 325, Constantinople in 381, and those that followed, are often presented as moments of theological clarity, gatherings where the finest minds of the tradition worked together to articulate the truth of the faith with greater precision. And they were, in part, exactly that. The questions they addressed were genuinely difficult. What was the relationship between Jesus and God the Father? Was Christ fully divine, fully human, both, or something in between? What was the nature of the Holy Spirit? These are not trivial questions, and the men who debated them were not trivial thinkers. But the councils were also political events, shaped by imperial power, factional rivalry, and the pressure of a Roman emperor who needed religious unity to serve the unity of his empire. Constantine, who convened the Council of Nicaea, was not a theologian. He was a military commander who had converted to Christianity and who understood with great political clarity that a fragmented church was a useless church from the perspective of imperial administration. The council's decisions were binding not only because of theological argument, but because they were backed by the authority of the state. Those who refused to accept the conclusions of the council faced not only ecclesiastical censure, but exile. This does not mean the theological decisions were wrong. It means they were made under conditions that made genuine diversity increasingly impossible, and that what was excluded in the process was not always error. Sometimes it was simply the other possible reading of the same ancient hope. The process of defining orthodoxy necessarily created the category of heresy, a word that originally meant simply a choice or a school of thought, before it came to mean a dangerous deviation from official truth. Figures such as Irenaeus of Lyon in the 2nd century and later Epiphanius of Salamis devoted enormous intellectual energy to cataloging, refuting, and condemning the varieties of Christian belief that they regarded as illegitimate. Their works survive. The works they condemned in many cases did not, at least not until the desert sands of Egypt gave back what had been buried. What the heresiologists, as they are called, preserved in their arguments against alternative teachings is, ironically, much of what we know about those teachings, filtered always through the perspective of those who found them intolerable. The teaching that felt most dangerous was not, at its core, about rejecting Christ or dismissing Scripture. It was about where authority ultimately lived. The Gnostic and other alternative Christian traditions that were condemned and suppressed tended to share a common suggestion, a suggestion that made institutional leadership genuinely nervous that the divine was not accessed primarily through the outer structure of the church, but through the inner experience of the awakened soul. If a believer could encounter God directly through contemplation, through gnosis, through the living light that the ancient texts described as already present within every human being, then what was the bishop for? What was the creed for? What was the canon of Scripture for, if the soul carried its own light that needed only to be recognized? This was not, in most cases, an argument against community, against love, against service, or against the life of faith. It was a question about the architecture of the sacred, about where the door was located. And it was a question that the emerging institutional church could not afford to leave open, because an open door in that direction leads not to schism in the theological sense, but to something more unsettling. The possibility that every soul is, in some sense, its own final authority. That possibility, beautiful as it may sound to a modern ear, was genuinely frightening in a world where the unity of the church was understood as the very condition of salvation. Before we go deeper, I want to ask you something. When you think about the spiritual traditions you have encountered in your own life, do you feel that unity protected truth? Or do you feel that it sometimes required the burial of something that deserved to live? Leave your reflection in the comments. This archive is not only a place of ancient questions, it is a place where old questions meet the living soul. 4.4. The descent beneath the surface. But we must go deeper still, because the conflict between doctrine and inner experience is not only a historical event, it is a permanent tension in the human relationship with the sacred, one that does not resolve itself simply because the councils have spoken or the manuscripts have been sealed. What was buried in the 4th century was not destroyed. Burial is not the same as death. What is placed in the dark does not cease to be. It waits. And the question the archive now asks is not simply what was buried beneath the official history of Christianity, but what is buried beneath the official history of the searching human soul. At the heart of the buried tradition, particularly in the Gnostic and related communities of early Christianity, was a teaching that can be expressed in a single image: the divine spark. The idea, found across many of the Nag Hammadi texts and in earlier philosophical traditions that influenced them, is that within every human being there exists a fragment of original divine light, something that fell into the material world not as a punishment, but as a kind of spiritual amnesia. The soul, in this understanding, is not primarily a creature waiting to be judged by an external God. It is a portion of the divine that has forgotten where it came from. And the entire purpose of spiritual life is the slow, sometimes painful, sometimes luminous process of remembering. This remembering was not understood as an intellectual exercise. It was not a matter of reading the correct texts or assenting to the correct propositions. It was an inner event, sometimes described in the ancient sources as awakening, sometimes as seeing, sometimes as returning. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, contains a saying attributed to Jesus that suggests the kingdom of heaven is not a distant place, but a present reality that the soul has not yet learned to see. It is spread upon the earth, and people do not see it. This is not the language of institutional compliance. It is the language of direct experience, of a veil lifted, of a silence beneath ordinary noise that turns out to be everything. What the buried tradition also preserved was a specific suspicion toward the idea that the material world and the social structures it contains could fully mediate the divine. This is not nihilism or escapism, as its critics often charged. It is closer to a form of spiritual discernment, an insistence that the soul must not mistake the container for the contents, the form for the living reality the form is meant to carry. In this sense, the buried teaching was not anti-church or anti-tradition. It was a permanent reminder, inconvenient and necessary in equal measure, that no outer structure, however beautiful, can replace the inner encounter with what the ancient seekers called the light that has never been extinguished. The act of burial itself carries a weight of meaning that the archive cannot ignore. When the monks, or whoever it was that sealed those 13 codices into a clay jar near Nag Hammadi, placed them in the earth, they were performing an act that was simultaneously one of protection and of grief. They were hiding what they loved because the world above the desert sand had become hostile to it. But burial in the symbolic language of many spiritual traditions is never only loss. It is also preservation. The seed is buried before it grows. The mystery is hidden before it can be truly sought. The question is sealed before the answer has any meaning. In this light, the suppression of early Christian diversity can be understood not only as an act of historical violence, real as that violence was, but as an act of inadvertent preservation. By declaring certain texts heretical and demanding their destruction, the councils of the early church drove those texts underground, literally, where the dry desert climate of Egypt kept them intact across 16 centuries. What was meant to be erased became, instead, a time capsule. The flame that was supposed to be extinguished was simply placed in a different kind of vessel, one made of clay and sealed with sand, waiting for a question that was patient enough to dig. And perhaps the deepest symbolic layer of all this is what the image of burial says about the human relationship with truth that feels too large or too free for the structures of ordinary life. We do not only bury ideas that are false, we sometimes bury ideas that frighten us precisely because they are true, because they carry a demand we are not yet ready to meet, because they open a door we are not certain we want to walk through. The buried secret of early Christianity is not only an archive of suppressed theology, it is a mirror of the human tendency to seal away whatever asks too much of us. Here is the hidden turn that the archive now reveals. What was buried was not only a set of alternative beliefs about God and salvation. What was buried was a particular understanding of the relationship between the individual soul and spiritual authority. The question that the suppressed traditions kept alive, the question that made them dangerous, was whether the soul needed an intermediary to reach the divine, or whether the divine was already present, already awake, already breathing within the innermost chamber of every human being who dared to be still enough to notice. This turn changes the nature of the inquiry entirely. It means that the ancient buried secret is not simply a theological curiosity for scholars of early religion. It is a question that every human being who has ever sat in a church, a mosque, a temple, or a moment of silent despair has quietly asked, is the sacred truly as far away as the official map suggests? Or is there a shorter road, a more direct path, one that passes not through any institution, but through the most intimate, most frightening, most luminous center of who I already am. The communities that carried these alternative visions of the sacred did not vanish cleanly when the councils condemned them. They moved, they adapted, they translated their symbols into new languages and preserved their questions inside traditions that were careful enough to survive. Some found refuge in the contemplative wings of monasticism, where the emphasis on inner stillness and direct encounter with God allowed a quieter version of the old hunger to be honored without explicit confrontation with official doctrine. Others carried the thread through what later generations would call mysticism, that recurring current within every major religion where the soul insists on approaching the sacred at closer range than the outer institution is always comfortable with. In Egypt, in Syria, in the Christian communities of late antiquity, there were figures who walked a very careful line between the official teaching and the older, deeper hunger. They spoke in the language of the church, used its symbols, observed its practices, and yet in their writings and in the communities that gathered around them, something older breathed, a sense that the divine was not only above but within, not only transcendent but intimate, not only judgment but light. These figures were not always named as heretics. Sometimes they were simply misunderstood. Sometimes they were quietly watched, and sometimes they were the ones who, centuries later, were quietly recognized as saints. There is a soul that has not yet encountered the buried teaching. It lives within the structures it was given, finds comfort in the familiar shapes of its tradition, understands salvation as something received from outside, granted by authority, mediated by institution. This is not a bad life. It can be a deeply faithful life, full of genuine love, genuine service, genuine devotion. But it is a life that, in certain moments, feels the ground beneath the given structure, feels a question rising that the structure was not entirely designed to answer. Is this all there is? Is the divine truly this far away? Is the road truly this narrow and this well supervised? The encounter with the buried teaching does not always bring peace. Sometimes it brings a disorientation that feels like grief. The grief of realizing that the map you were given was real but incomplete, that there were roads on it that had been quietly erased, not because they led nowhere, but because they led somewhere the institution had decided it could not follow. This grief is not cynicism. It is a threshold. It is the beginning of a different kind of faith, one that does not abandon the tradition, but that has learned to read it more slowly, more carefully, more honestly, with an eye for what the margins of the old manuscripts still carry. What comes after this threshold, for those who are willing to cross it, is not necessarily a departure from faith, but a deepening of it. It is the discovery that the tradition is larger than any single authorized reading of it, that the divine is more generous than any single council could fully legislate, and that the soul, far from being alone in its questions, has been asking the same question for 2,000 years in 100 different languages. The buried secret does not destroy faith. For those who approach it honestly, it tends to do something far more surprising. It makes faith stranger, wilder, more difficult, and infinitely more alive. The reason these buried voices speak with such force in the present moment is not only because the Nag Hammadi texts were rediscovered in the 20th century, though that discovery was genuinely transformative for religious scholarship and for many individual seekers. It is because the questions they were asking are questions that have never stopped being asked. The hunger for direct encounter with the sacred, the distrust of institutions that claim a monopoly on the divine, the sense that something essential has been buried beneath the official version of spiritual reality. These are not ancient problems solved by modern progress. They are permanent features of the human soul's relationship with the sacred. In a world that has grown deeply suspicious of institutional authority, in which millions of people describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, in which ancient texts are read not only by specialists but by ordinary seekers looking for something the modern world has not been able to provide. The buried voices of early Christianity speak into an extraordinary silence. They say, the question you are asking is not new. You're not alone in asking it. It was asked in the same desert where the first monks went to be still, in the same cities where the first councils debated, in the same language of longing that has always been the soul's native tongue. The texts were buried, but the ideas traveled. Through the Manichaean tradition, which spread from Persia across the Roman Empire and into Central Asia, some of the themes of the early Gnostic communities found new life in new forms. Through the Cathars of medieval southern France, who taught a dualistic vision of the world that church and empire eventually suppressed with tremendous violence, the old questions echoed in a new language. Through the Hermetic tradition, through Jewish Kabbalah, through the Christian mysticism of Meister Eckhart and Marguerite Porete, and the unknown authors of texts like The Cloud of Unknowing, the thread continued, sometimes barely visible, sometimes burning with unexpected brightness. Each time the buried idea surfaced, it provoked a version of the same response it had provoked in the 4th century, either careful integration into the official framework or suppression. Meister Eckhart's works were condemned after his death. Marguerite Porete was burned at the stake in 1310 for a book in which she described the soul's direct union with the divine in terms that the Inquisition found intolerable. The pattern repeated itself across the centuries with a consistency that suggests it was not random. The idea that the divine dwells within the human soul in a way that exceeds institutional mediation has always been in every tradition that has encountered it, both the most intimate truth and the most politically inconvenient one. We opened this archive with the question about what was buried, and what we have found is not a single secret, but a living wound. A wound that runs through the entire history of organized religion, the wound of a tradition that began in fire and silence and direct encounter, and that found, as all movements must, that fire cannot be safely administered without a form. The form was necessary. The creeds, the councils, the structures of liturgy and hierarchy, these were not invented by cynics. They were built by frightened, faithful people trying to protect something they loved against the chaos of an empire that wanted to consume it. But every form, however necessary, has a shadow. And the shadow of the form is the burial of the formless. What the journey through this archive has offered is not an argument against tradition. It is an invitation to see the tradition more completely, to hear the voices that the official record muffled without quite erasing, to understand that the diversity of early Christian belief was not a failure of unity, but an expression of spiritual vitality that even centuries of institutional effort could not entirely extinguish. The buried secret was never fully buried. It was waiting, as all deep things wait, for someone patient enough to sit with the silence long enough to hear it breathe. And so we return to where we began, the question of what kind of freedom the soul had received. Was what Christianity buried in the early centuries a genuine threat to the integrity of the faith, a dangerous heresy that would have fragmented the tradition before it could survive? Or was it a mirror, a reflection of the soul's deepest hunger, held up at precisely the moment when that hunger was becoming inconvenient? Or was it something more unsettling still, a truth that was not wrong, but simply too large, too free, too intimate to be safely institutionalized? The archive does not offer a single answer. It offers the question back, carefully preserved, still warm, still asking. What the manuscript finally holds, beneath all the layers of condemnation and clay and centuries of silence, is not proof that the church was corrupt, or that the councils were purely political, or that the alternative traditions had the final truth. What it holds is something both more complicated and more beautiful. Evidence that the human encounter with the sacred has always been too large for any single container. That the soul has always found ways to ask its deepest questions, even when the questions were declared forbidden. And that what we bury most carefully is rarely what we believe is worthless. We bury what we cannot afford to lose and are not yet ready to carry openly. In that sense, the buried secret of early Christianity is not a wound inflicted from outside. It is a gift the tradition gave to its own future, sealed in clay, waiting for us. If this archive speaks to the part of you that still searches beneath the surface of the given story, subscribe and return. Every manuscript opened here carries the same promise, that what has been veiled is not gone, and that the questions history tried to seal are the ones most worth holding in the silence of your own searching. Somewhere beneath the desert of what is officially known, there is a sealed chamber. It has been there for a long time, longer than any of the arguments that tried to account for it. Inside that chamber, wrapped in leather and preserved by dry, ancient air, are the questions that the early believers were not permitted to keep asking openly. Questions about the soul's freedom, the divine's nearness, the possibility of a light that no council called into existence and no condemnation could put out. The chamber is not empty. It has never been empty. And the strange mercy of the archive is this: the sealed chamber is not only beneath the desert of Egypt, it is beneath the silence of every person who has ever sat with a question too sacred to say aloud, too persistent to abandon, too alive to bury entirely. You have been here before. The manuscript knows your name, and the question it carries has been waiting with extraordinary patience, exactly as long as it has taken you to find your way back to it.